Welcome back, Spare Parts Army. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. On Thursday, January 5th, President Biden announced a new $3 billion American weapons package for Ukraine that for the first time ever will include 50 of the M2A2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Let's analyze how the United States approved this emergency package so quickly, what the Russian response is, and whether this new vehicle's capabilities could have a significant impact on the outcome of Ukraine's potential new counteroffensive in 2023. A few weeks ago, the head of the Ukrainian military, General Zaluzny, reported that he needed 600 infantry fighting vehicles to push Russia all the way back to their original borders before the invasion. If we add up the 50 Bradleys plus the 40 German Martyrs and toss in some of the 500 captured Russian IFVs, it gets General Zaluzny close to his goal. Ukrainian military planners have a few options in front of them right now for where to plan their next offensive push after successfully capturing Kherson and Kharkiv. One of the most likely places for the assault would be to cut south into the muddy flats of the Zaporizhzhia region. The tracked M2 Bradley would be more effective at handling this muddy terrain and would have way higher firepower compared to the wheeled MRAPs. Wherever this hypothetical offensive takes place along the whole front line, it's going to require advancing roughly 100 kilometers. If they choose Zaporizhzhia, they'd need to move 78 kilometers or about 49 miles, where the maneuver would end at the strategically key town of Melitopol. I spoke with an active duty U.S. Army Bradley commander, Justin Taylor, to find out some inside information on the Bradley.
But essentially the software package that is in the latest model of the Brads just helps with a little bit more with targeting, like if your Bradley is moving and the target you're shooting at is moving, and then with just digital battle tracking, so integrating GPS, giving the commanders basically a mini map inside of your Bradley that you can, communicate with others. You can look at phase lines, you can look at ops terms and graphics. You can do everything you need to do with that. It's super easy to use, it's super simple, super useful.
Why are these infantry fighting vehicles so vital to the plan to push Russia out of Ukraine? The Bradley is specifically designed to operate alongside main battle tanks in offensive operations to capture and hold territory. It provides mobile, protected transport of infantry to critical points on the battlefield and can suppress anti-tank teams better than its companion tank. It accomplishes this task by making use of its massive stabilized 25mm autocannon that can fire on the move at 200 rounds per minute to take out light armor or personnel, and its tow-launched anti-tank guided missile can destroy enemy tanks. The M2 Bradley has by the book a range of 300 miles or 480 kilometers, but in combat conditions that's going to be far less at about 120 miles or approximately 82 hours on a single tank of gas. If Ukraine was able to recapture this town, it would cut off Russia's supply lines in the region and sever their land bridge inside of Ukraine. Best case scenario for Ukraine is that this could possibly lead to a collapse of the Russian defensive positions in the south. One of the main advantages of the Bradley over the BMP that Russia and Ukraine use is its advanced armor that has been upgraded since its original introduction in 1981. According to open source numbers and anecdotal reports from the Iraq War, the Bradley can stop a BMP's 30mm round thanks to its new explosive reactive armor that can take 2 hits, and the addition of a 1¼ inch thick welded on steel armor plate on the front and right side of the Bradley. But there's a trade-off. The Bradley is over 10 tons heavier at around 33 tons and about 5 miles per hour slower at 35 miles per hour. On the other hand, the BMP's armor is notoriously thin and unable to stop the Bradley's 25mm AP munitions.
So I think the biggest advantage that the Bradley can bring to this fight specifically that outmatches it compared to like BMDs and BMPs is its optics. The optics on the Bradley are insane. The range and clarity you have with those, as well as how good the thermal resolution is in those things, is if I were to just scan it over to some of my soldiers standing around, I could tell which of them had a cold because their noses were just slightly colder than the rest. Like that's how high the thermal resolution on that thing.
Task and Purpose senior Pentagon reporter Jeff Schogel asked the Department of Defense a great question about this.
We've got Jeff Schogel, Task and Purpose.
Thank you. At the risk of opening up Pandora's box, could you please describe the difference between a Bradley fighting vehicle and a tank?
It's not a tank, but it's a tank killer. A Bradley is a armored vehicle that has a firepower capability that can deliver troops into combat.
Of course, it'll be up to Ukrainian General Zaluzny and his advisors to determine how to best deploy the Bradley. And they do have a few different options. They could send all 50 of them to one single location in Zaporizhzhia, but that could telegraph and give away their plan on where they're going to strike. On the other hand, Ukraine's military command could instead choose to divide Bradley platoons into separate sections all along the front line and have the benefit of reinforcing multiple regions. Keeping the Bradleys near each other would help for a few reasons. It would make logistical support easier because it would allow the vehicles to cross-load and share ammunition for their main turret with each other. The US is reportedly sending 250,000 rounds of 25mm autocannon ammo and 500 rounds of the TOW anti-tank guided missiles that can only be used in the Bradley IFV and is not compatible with most of Ukraine's existing vehicles and their weapon systems like the BMP. Keeping the Bradleys grouped together would cut down on the amount of repair and maintenance locations needed, which all need to have access to the limited number of spare parts and Bradley engineer experts. And this gets us into the concern about not just Ukraine's ability to maintain foreign equipment in their country, but any army's ability to do this. Historically, it's been a very difficult task. In 1996, for instance, the US government sent military helicopters as aid to Mexico to help them fight cartels. And they ended up sending these helicopters right back because they didn't have the spare parts and knowledge to operate it. So the US has learned from these mistakes, and it's careful to send only equipment that they can support outside in foreign countries. This is likely one of the main reasons why we haven't seen the labor-intensive M1 Abrams yet. The Department of Defense hasn't figured out a way to support the M1 Abrams and its logistical tail in Ukraine yet. So in the United States Army, there's an entire MOS, a job called 91 Mike, dedicated entirely to maintaining and repairing the Bradley. The 91 Mike goes through 3 months of training to be qualified for this role. To give you an idea of the knowledge that they eventually need to learn at the advanced levels, we found this US Army 272-page training manual checklist of all of the individual tasks necessary to fix the Bradley. There are hundreds of different diagnostics to run to keep the systems working. Fortunately, the crew roles of gunner and driver require far less training, as the Bradley was designed to be intuitive and not overly complicated during combat. Crew roles have a 2-month-long course to learn its weapon systems and driving functions.
I will say the big defining thing between a brand new crew and an experienced crew is fixing problems as they arise in the turret. It's a chain gun inside of an armored vehicle. A lot of moving parts, things can go wrong. Links can get stuck in the feed chute, the sear is not engaging. And that said, almost all of the problems that we had could be fixed with a hand crank and a giant screwdriver that we would just keep in the turret.
Timing is incredibly important for this potential second Ukrainian offensive. One theory is Kiev will strike when the ground is frozen in February, while others believe waiting until the end of March or April when it begins to heat up to 60 degrees Fahrenheit in Ukraine is a better time.
Makes an even bigger difference the fact that it's wintertime currently. And I think that might be part of the rush to get them over there, because thermals work a lot better when it's cold. There's a larger temperature difference between a hot target, and whatever is surrounding it.
This might be part of the reason why emergency approval was used by President Biden to fast-track this shipment. While Washington has a reputation for being all kinds of bureaucratic and having red tape that slows everything down, this isn't the case here. This is because President Biden used what's called the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act Presidential Drawdown Authority. Drawdown Authority gives the president the ability to send foreign military aid like the M2 Bradley during emergencies without first seeking approval from Congress. Supporters of this power say that it's the only real flexibility granted to the president to allow him to shape foreign policy. Critics of it say that it's used to unilaterally evade congressional review of foreign aid. But that might not exactly and entirely be accurate, since Congress does have to, in part, agree to increase the cap of the president's drawdown authority. So they increased his cap from $100 million all the way up to $11 billion this year. My understanding is that this is Congress essentially telling the president that they agree with his decision to send aid to Ukraine without their specifically voting on it and giving him access to the funds to do so. But sending the M2 Bradley is a significant departure from the previous strategy for weapons aid to Ukraine. So far, many of the weapon systems sent were arguably best used in defensive or support roles like the HIMARS, Patriot missile, M113, the Javelin missile launchers. The fact that these weapon systems were defensive in nature was often used as justification by politicians for sending them to Ukraine. But the Bradley represents a shift.
That we are always looking at what Ukraine needs and providing them what they need when they need it. And their battlefield needs have evolved over time.
It's an offensive tool. And I want to make an important distinction here that could get lost in the conversation. There are two levels to look at with military aid. On the geopolitical high level, any weapon Ukraine uses is literally used to defend themselves, since they were the ones who were invaded. But on the tactical ground level, the M2 Bradley is an offensive weapon that's going to be great for the Ukrainian armed forces to take and hold land. So what is Russia's response to this change? Russian Ambassador Anatoly Anatolov said, "The Bradley decision showed Moscow that the US has not even tried to listen to our numerous calls to take into account possible consequences of such a dangerous course by Washington." And that, quote, "nobody should have doubts who bears responsibility for prolonging this conflict." The counterpoint to the Russian argument would of course be that Russia should have thought about all of that before invading Ukraine. With over 6,700 Bradleys in the US inventory, this delivery could just be the beginning, and Russia has no clear way of retaliating or preventing the delivery. So this will mark the first time the M2 Bradley will see combat in Eastern Europe. I don't know if you believe in destiny, but this will be like the Bradley doing what it was born to do, fulfilling its original purpose. Because the vehicle was originally introduced in the 1980s during the Cold War defense buildup that Ronald Reagan presided over. It was designed specifically to stop Russian BMPs in the Fulda Gap of Europe. At the time, military planners envisioned that nuclear weapons would shape future battlefields, so they made the Bradley resistant to radiation exposure. So how will it perform in its intended purpose? At first glance, on paper, the Bradley looks like it should be worse than the Soviet BMP. I mean, it weighs more, it's slower, there's less room in the hull, so it carries 1 or 2 less infantry to fight. Its main cannon is a smaller caliber than the Soviets. When it was first built, analysts thought its tall, giraffe-like height of 2.9 meters would make it stick out like a sore thumb on the battlefield, making it difficult to hide and easy for the enemy to spot. All of this led to criticisms that the M2 Bradley was a reconnaissance vehicle that couldn't scout and a troop transport that could barely carry any troops to the battle. Add to that a troubled development history that was even turned into a hilarious movie, The Pentagon Wars. It all seemed to lend credibility to the idea that the Bradley was a huge mistake. But the Bradleys had a few tricks up its sleeve that would have been hard to imagine in the 1980s. It was given some key capabilities in its fire control system and tactics that have given it a massive advantage over the Russian BMP in past combat engagements. The M2A2 version that the United States is sending to Ukraine is the older last generation, and if we assume it's the ODS upgraded variant that's being sent, the Bradley will have high-resolution thermal imaging, laser rangefinder, GPS navigation capabilities that we've seen are largely absent from most Russian BMPs.
So I'm going to assume that these M2A2s aren't going to be being pulled from some unit like we've seen with like the 113 being pulled by National Guard units. It makes more sense to pull from pre-post stock or pre-position stock. These are basically warehouses in Eastern Europe and Korea full of untouched vehicles that are essentially the break glass in case of emergency version of vehicles for us. I know that the Bradleys in those are the A2 ODS versions. It would just make a lot more sense. They're already over in Europe. They're just sitting there. Their whole point was to help with a European war.
This theory is actually supported by recent footage that was uploaded by users to Twitter showing the M2 Bradley getting transported out of Bulgaria, possibly towards Ukraine. The sensitivity of this fire control system was explained by Iraq veteran Bradley Master Gunner Michael Koroza, who said, quote, "You can see the difference in heat by 1 degree, so I can see the difference between your clothes and your skin. So there's nothing and nowhere you can hide from those thermals. I've had many occasions where at great distances I can tell dismounted friendlies there's somebody hiding in the bushes right next to them." This shows how the M2 Bradley can support infantry. This fire control system has a magnification of 12 times and can spot enemies up to 4,000 meters away. Its 25 Mike Bushmaster chain gun, the main gun, has a dual feed system that allows the gunner to instantly choose between armor-piercing and anti-personnel HE rounds. Usually it's set up with 70 rounds of AP armor-piercing ammo and 230 high explosive with another 600 rounds in storage. This means 50 Bradleys sent to Ukraine can carry a combined 45,000 rounds on them. The remaining 200,000 or so will probably be ferried to them using other vehicles as they run out. Another reason why it's so important to probably keep them in the same area or region. Each tow launcher carries 2 missiles with room for 5 reloads inside the hull. According to open source military intelligence, the BMP-2 and its 30mm cannon can be somewhat of a challenge to reload and can take up to 2 hours even if the ammunition is already prepared, although the capacity of their trays are larger at 160 rounds of AP and 340 rounds of HE. The Bradley crew can reload their ammo within 12 minutes. Most of the BMPs that we've observed in Ukraine do not have long-range anti-tank guided missile launchers that will be on these Bradleys. Over the decades, weapon effectiveness has often turned out to have more to do with engineering the penetrators and materials inside of the bullets instead of the caliber size. The United States pioneered depleted uranium for use in infantry fighting vehicles like the Bradley. We don't know if the US government is sending any depleted uranium munitions provided to Ukraine, but if they are, the ammo is far better at penetrating enemy armor than traditional steel rounds. Each 25mm depleted uranium weighs over a pound and has increased behind the target effectiveness, where the likelihood of detonating fuel and ammo in the enemy vehicle is far higher. It's worth noting that this ammo is controversial because there are potential health hazards associated with it if it enters the body through embedded fragments, contaminated wounds, and inhaling or ingesting it. So don't go near any vehicles hit with depleted uranium ammo and don't lick them, as tempting as it might be. Another difference is in doctrine. Right now, Ukraine is training 500 soldiers per month in a newly created Combined Arms Warfare Training Center at a NATO base in Germany.
Many of you have heard about our launch that will happen later this month of new combined arms training. So we will be able to enable the Ukrainians to take advantage of this capability.
The Bradley can potentially take advantage of this new skill because it can mark enemy locations on GPS and use them to call for fire by digitally sending those coordinates back to HIMARS artillery, which can quickly fire rockets on that location. If a vehicle is able to hand off a target to a different weapon system like artillery or air power, this is far more preferable because it conserves ammunition and prevents it from pointlessly revealing its location by opening fire.
So how the gun on a Bradley works is that it operates off of an LRF, laser rangefinder, and that's how it determines how high it needs to automatically slew the gun while at whatever you're aiming at. So the gunner just pulls down on a little switch on his joystick, it shoots a laser out, it comes back, the targeting computer gets the distance to that target and will automatically adjust the gun. But the most useful aspect of that to the Ukrainians probably is that once you get that return, it also gives you a 10-digit grid of whatever it was that you were just pointing at. 10-digit grid being within 1 meter of accuracy, automatically, instantly know where it is.
It's these kinds of high-tech combined arm advances that make the Bradley better than most of the BMPs that are in service in the Russian army. The first Gulf War gives us some idea of how the Bradley stacks up against the Soviet BMP. While it's not a perfect comparison to how combat might unfold in Eastern Europe, we saw how in the Gulf War, when 2,200 Bradleys went up against 1,800 BMPs, they only lost 3 Bradleys to enemy fire. But the other side of the argument is that the Bradley was able to benefit from air superiority and close air support during their famous run in Iraq, and that the story would have been very different in Eastern Europe. For one thing, the line of sight in the desert is almost unlimited, while in Eastern Europe you're going to have tree lines every few hundred meters, greatly reducing visibility in many locations and reducing one of the Bradley's greatest advantages. The offensive fighting doctrine used by the Bradley is a very different strategy compared to the Soviet BMP style tactics. Once a platoon of Bradleys expects to come into contact with the enemy, they move into what's called bounding overwatch. This is where 1 or 2 vehicles move forward a couple of hundred meters to a position of cover, while the rest of the Bradley platoon waits stationary from an overwatch position. This leapfrog tactic allows you to have the protection of covering fire from your teammates when you are at the most vulnerable advancing forward. It's slower than the Russian offensive doctrine, but the American tactic is more methodical and results in fewer casualties, hopefully. In the US military, one of their favorite tactics that worked well for them was hunter-killer teams, where they used 3 Bradley fighting vehicles and 1 main battle tank paired together.
They'll move to what's called a VDO, or a vehicle drop-off point. That is where the dismounts and the mech will drop ramp, they'll get out, and they'll start moving up on the objective. Meanwhile, the 4 Bradleys, which are now empty, are now essentially that platoon's support by fire. It's a mobile support by fire, which is awesome. And again, it also allows for what's called hunter-killer technique, where the gunner is engaging a target. I'm still scanning with my CIVs, the commander. I spot a target, and then when my gunner is done destroying that target, I can take over the turret, hold down a button, and the turret immediately swivels to what I'm aiming at as the commander. Once he gets visual contact through his sight, I let go, and he starts engaging the target.
Unlike Russian doctrine, the Bradley will keep their squads mounted inside the protection of the hull of the vehicles during the assault. There's room for 6 or 7 infantry in the back and a crew of 3. The ramp is dropped, and the dismounted troops are released if they encounter enemies that are located on restrictive terrain that the vehicles cannot reach. Right now, the US Army is in the middle of retiring its Bradley fleet and attempting to develop a brand new platform from the ground up called the OMFV, so selling or giving away old Bradleys is in the United States' favor. These systems could prove highly effective in helping Ukraine during a time that is considered a pivotal moment in the fight. If you like this video, please consider checking out this one about the history of corruption at Northrop Grumman. I think you guys will really like it. I've been your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Thank you for watching Task and Purpose.